2024, CSIS revealed China's secretive footprints in Cuba. Satellite intelligence revealed China building massive long-range radar arrays right under the nose of the US homeland. They are designed to intercept telemetry data from rocket launches at Cape Canaveral and map military satellite downlinks. In June 2024, a Russian nuclear submarine docks in Havana, while Chinese technicians calibrate state-of-the-art eavesdropping dishes nearby. Cuba is no longer just a struggling Caribbean nation. It has become the ultimate joint logistic hub for America's greatest adversaries. There are instances showing how Cuba, a pacing theater in the Indo-Pacific, uses geography in the Western Hemisphere to disrupt US power projections. Recent leaks reveals US intelligence is actively modeling how Cuba would respond to an outbreak of a major kinetic conflict. If deterrences fail in Europe or Asia, what role Havana play in the outbreak of the World War III? Come, let's talk about it in today's episode. Hello and welcome to our very special show. I'm Shreya and you're watching The Strategist by National Defense. To understand the present context of Cuba, we need to rewind history.
Any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
Cuba's independence came in 1902, but with strings attached. The Platt Amendment, an amendment to the US Army Appropriation Bill, established the terms under which the United States would end its military occupation of Cuba, but given 8 conditions. The most interesting of which was the United States reserved the right to intervene in Cuban affairs in order to defend Cuban independence and to maintain a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. This gave the US total right to intervene, setting up decades of political instability and the rise of the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. Cut to 1959, when enters Fidel Castro. His guerrilla revolution overthrew Batista and seized US properties. Castro initially claimed his movement was nationalist rather than communist, but tensions with the United States rapidly pushed Cuba towards the Soviet Union. For the United States, Cuba is important because it is located just 90 miles south of Florida. Cuba commands key maritime trade routes and serves a linchpin for Caribbean security. Hence, losing control over it is not a good sign for the US during the Cold War era. Washington retaliated with a total economic embargo and the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a secret invasion planned by the CIA to overthrow Castro. About 1,400 Cuban exiles trained by the CIA landed at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961. The operation approved by John F. Kennedy. But the US had an embarrassing failure due to poor planning, lack of US air support, strong Cuban resistance, and most importantly, Castro already knew about the invasion rumors. Now, this failure led to huge embarrassment in the US, strengthening Castro politically and pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union. But this wasn't the only probable incident that could have ignited war in Cuba. But the most dangerous confrontation was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in July 1962 formed a confidential agreement with Cuban Premier Fidel Castro to install Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba to prevent any future invasion attempts. In late summer, the construction of various missile sites commenced, but US intelligence uncovered signs of a general Soviet arms accumulation in Cuba, including the Soviet Il-28 bombers. On September 4th, President Kennedy delivered a public warning regarding the introduction of offensive weapons into Cuba, and on October 22nd, he ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba and demanded missile removal. For 13 days, the world feared nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended in October 28 when the USSR agreed to remove missiles from Cuba. The US secretly agreed to remove missiles from Turkey and also promised not to invade Cuba. But there also came a time when both countries came near a near-nuclear mishap, averted due to the wisdom of Russian Brigadier Chief of Staff Vasily Arkhipov. Russia sent 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class submarines towards the Caribbean. One of them was a B-59. Nuclear submarine B-59 was so dangerously lethal that United States was not aware of the existence of such nuclear submarine with Russia at that point of time. B-59 carried a nuclear-tipped torpedo. The torpedo reportedly had explosive power similar to that used at the Hiroshima attack. It just happened that the submarine had lost radio contact with Moscow and was being hunted by the US Navy destroyers. After being prolonged underwater, internal temperatures reportedly exceed 45 degrees. Carbon dioxide levels were rising, crew members were exhausted and stressed. The Americans did not intend to attack the submarine. They used practiced depth charges, small signaling explosive meant to force the submarine to surface. But the Soviet crew inside B-59 reportedly feared that the war may have already started or the US Navy is attacking for real. Captain Valentin Savitsky became convinced that they might be under attack. Later, it became public that he wanted to even launch the nuclear torpedo at the American fleet. However, Soviet protocol required authorization from 3 senior officers on board: Captain Valentin Savitsky, Political Officer Ivan Maslenikov, Brigadier Chief Staff Vasily Arkhipov. The 2 officers reportedly agreed, but Vasily Arkhipov refused. He argued against launching and insisted submarine to surface instead, establish contact with Moscow and avoid triggering any nuclear war based on assumptions. After intense debate inside the submarine, Arkhipov persuaded the captain not to fire and B-59 was surfaced instead. This would have become a major near-missile incident if the nuclear torpedo had been launched. US naval forces would have retaliated immediately, and Washington may have interpreted the attack as the beginning of the Soviet nuclear war. Escalation towards a full US-Soviet exchange was possible. But this chain of events in history made Cuba known as the Hot Line. Its close proximity to the US, while its closeness to Russia, a stark rival of the US, made it a crucial territory. In military strategy, geography is destiny. Cuba sits 90 miles from Florida, less than the distance of a morning commute for some Americans. But for the Pentagon and the Kremlin, this island isn't just a tropical paradise. It's a stationary aircraft carrier parked in the gateway to the Gulf of Mexico. Cuba's 5,700-kilometer coastline controls the 3 ultimate choke points of the Americans: the Florida Strait, the Yucatan Channel, and the Windward Passage. Control Cuba and you control the neck of the global trade, monitoring every drop of oil, every cargo ship, and every naval deployment moving between the US Gulf Coast and the Atlantic Ocean. Even the US military realized this in 1903, seizing Guantanamo Bay to establish a permanent deep-water naval stronghold that still holds today. The Soviets built the Lourdes Signal Intelligence Facility near Havana, one of their largest espionage bases on Earth, intercepting US military and diplomatic data straight out of the sky. But Cuba wasn't just a passive chess piece. This Caribbean island projected massive military power globally, shipping over 50,000 combat troops in Angola and deploying forces to Ethiopia, executing one of the largest overseas interventions by any developing nation in history. Coming back to the current world in 2016, the traditional armies of the Cold War had diminished. Yet the espionage conflict in Havana reignited with a new chilling phenomenon. Diplomats from the US and Canada, along with CIA agents based in Havana, capital of Cuba, started disclosing abrupt, crippling neurological incidents. Victims reported sharp, focused buzzing and clicking noises, which were immediately accompanied by dizziness, mental confusion, and intense head pressure. Referred to as the Havana Syndrome and formally categorized as the Anomalous Health Incident or AHI. The occurrence expanded worldwide among US staff in Moscow, Beijing, and Vienna. Initially, scientific evaluation highlighted the Frey effect, a phenomena in which pulsed microwave or radio frequency energy enables human brain to internally perceive sound, affecting brain tissue without visible external indicators. For years, bureaucratic agreement was proactive, with a highly debated intelligence evaluation determining a foreign enemy assault was very unlikely, citing the incident as a stress or mass psychogenic illness. Right now, Cuba is trapped in its most severe internal crisis since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The island is experiencing a perfect storm of inflation, food scarcity, medicine shortage, and a near total breakdown of public transportation. But the most glaring symptom of this collapse is the energy crisis. Due to several fuel shortages and rapidly decaying electrical grid, some regions are facing catastrophic blackout lasting up to 20 hours a day. Historically, when a regime faces this level of existential pressure, one of the two things happens. It either collapses completely, creating a massive vacuum, or looks abroad for some powerful lifelines to keep itself afloat. And that is exactly where Russia and China enters the frame. The White House recently issued a stark declaration officially labeling Cuba as an extraordinary threat to American national security. Washington isn't just worried about the local instability, they are sounding the alarm over quiet, coordinated buildup of Russian intelligence infrastructure and Chinese electronic surveillance facilities right in America's backyard. China has stepped up in Cuba's economic lifeline, providing critical emergency aid and infrastructure support to patch up the following electrical grid. But this aid doesn't come free. US intelligence agencies claim that in exchange, Beijing has expanded its electronic interception capabilities on the island. From these facilities, Chinese intelligence can monitor military communication, intercept satellite data, and track naval movements along the entire southeastern United States. Meanwhile, Russia is reviving its old Soviet-era networks, explicitly stating its intent to maintain a powerful geopolitical footprint in the Western Hemisphere. Russian naval vessels have begun making highly publicized port calls in Havana, serving a direct message in Washington that if NATO expands its borders in Europe, we can project power on yours. To be clear, a full-scale US invasion in Cuba remains highly unlikely. Cuba lacks the military power to provoke a direct conflict, and the Pentagon's strategic priorities are focused elsewhere. However, the density of intelligence operation and the instability of the regime means the risk of an accidental military spark is higher than it has been in the decades. That's it for today's episode of The Strategist. I'm Shreya signing off. Until then, for more such insightful global analysis, tune into our show The Strategist every Wednesday and Sunday at 6 p.m. only.